Here. Closed caption is available, and I think it will be on the recording as well. So if you want to see the closed caption, I can actually see it at the bottom of my screen, and maybe you can as well. So as I mentioned, today we have Brodie Badcock-Parks with us, and Brodie is a member of the board of Nova Scotia Bird Society, and he joined the Nova Scotia Bird Society in 2018. He also is a researcher at Dalhousie University. I think, Brodie, you're currently doing your PhD. Is that right?
Yep. Well, right now I'm teaching. I'm just an instructor right now, but yeah, sort of in on a graduate school sabbatical, if you'd like.
Oh, good for you. Although teaching is a heavy workload, I'm sure.
It's really I'm really enjoying it. I'm really enjoying it.
Good. That's good to hear. Brodie's going to talk about human-associated impacts on songbird brain and behavior. As we understand more about bird brains, we can inform habitat conservation in ways that allow songbirds to develop behaviors related to vocal communication that are critical to mate selection and ultimately species survival. Songbirds, like humans, learn their vocabularies first from hearing and then by imitating an adult tutor. As a consequence, songbirds have considerable infrastructure in their brains dedicated to listening to, learning, and responding to changes in their acoustic environment. Brodie will help us consider how anthropogenic or human-associated factors such as increased noise, decreased food availability as a result of changing habitat, and environmental contaminants alter both behavior and the brains of many songbirds. Brodie is a songbird biologist and researcher in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University. He holds a Bachelor of Science, an honors degree, and a Master of Science both in neuroscience. His research focuses primarily on the brain, behavior, interaction in songbirds. It almost sounds like philosophy. And prior to graduate work, Brodie was part of the conservation team at Nature Canada, where he studied changes in post-breeding, pre-migration swallow roosts along the Lakes Ontario and Erie. Brodie's favorite bird is one of my favorite birds too, a purple martin. Purple martins are the largest swallow in North America. When they approach their nesting site, they dive from the sky at great speeds with their wings tucked, just like the peregrine falcon does when hunting smaller birds. Pretty neat bird. I'm sure many of us have seen purple martin. There was certainly a lot of them around after Hurricane Dorian. And so many people who hadn't seen them before maybe saw them. The reason it's one of my favorites is that one of the birds in Dorian that actually came, that I was able to see from my yard. It was a pretty cool yard bird.
Good yard bird.
Yeah, I was pretty excited. Yeah. I even had a photo, a terrible photo, but identifiable. And also the bird that Brodie would most like to see, I guess you haven't seen this one yet, Brodie, is the Royal Flycatcher, which is a pretty neat looking bird. I have a picture of it in front of me, but I won't, maybe we'll share it later. Brodie will be pleased to take your questions at the end of his presentation, so please type them in the chat, or at the end you can ask him directly. Welcome, Brodie.
Okay. Thanks very much for all of that, Diane. And thank you, and thanks to Susan for inviting me here today. Thanks to all of you out there in the audience for tuning in, especially with this meeting having been rescheduled. It's also great to see so many familiar names and faces in the audience. I'm really grateful for you to be here, and I'm really excited and pleased to spend the next few minutes to talk to you a little bit about my work, and in particular, a really interesting side project that I've taken on in the last few years, looking at how we as humans impact birds, their behavior, and their brains. So as Diane said, I'm a researcher and an instructor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University, and I'm really lucky in that I get to spend a lot of my working time thinking about talking to really smart people and working with birds. And as Diane said, I'm really interested as a behavioral neuroscientist in what's known as the brain-behavior interaction. So that is, I'm really interested in how changes in the brain lead to changes in behavior, like singing, but also how changes in behavior lead to changes in the brain. And I do a lot of my work looking at the brain behavior interaction in birds, songbirds or passerines in particular. But I'm also really interested in how we as humans, for lack of a better word, interact with this interaction. So that is, how do human activities impact bird behavior, for example, singing, and how do these human-caused changes in singing behavior lead to changes in the bird's brain and in their bodies? So I've actually been studying and researching how humans impact birds longer than I've actually been studying birds and their brains. And I wanted to talk briefly about the first work that I ever did with birds, not because it's particularly unique or exciting, even though I think it's really exciting, but it was the work that I did very early on in my career when I was 18, 19 years old, that really impacted and laid the groundwork for the work that I've done more recently, and which forms the presentation for my talk today. So as Diane mentioned, my favorite bird in the world is the purple martin for many reasons, but partly because it's the first species that I ever worked with. So right after I went to university, very early on, I took an intern position with the conservation team at Nature Canada. They're an environmental NGO based out of Ottawa, and they do lots of really incredible and amazing bird research. Prior to doing this work, I hadn't really worked with birds before. I mean, I knew a little bit about birds. I was interested in biology. But I very quickly realized that working with birds was something I really wanted to do. And I've essentially been working with birds ever since. So North America's swallows are particularly interesting to me, and purple martins especially so, in part because they are long distance migrants. So purple martins, hold on, let me see if I can do this. Purple martins breed here in the northern part of North America, southern Canada, United States, formerly here in Nova Scotia, but their range has changed around a little bit. And after the young of the year fledge the nest, they undergo a very quick long distance migration down to the Amazon basin of Brazil. And this is a very long distance migration. But what's really interesting is that there's a very short period of time at the end of the summer between the time that the young fledge and the time that the birds migrate down to South America, essentially in one fell swoop, where purple martins and other swallow species like barn swallows and bank swallows and tree swallows and others form what are known, as Diane said, post-breeding pre-migratory roosts in marshy areas along the southern Great Lakes. And in these roosts, I like to consider them like dormitories, essentially where you get thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of birds in very small concentrated areas, usually in marshy areas along Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. There are so many birds in these roosts that they actually get picked up on weather radar in the morning when the birds swoop up from the roost to start their day. So this image here was collected that I did as part of a presentation a few years ago when I was back in Nature Canada. And this is basically a composite image taken over the course of one morning. As the sun rises in the east, purple martins and other swallows leave their roosts, and they form these large donut shapes that actually get picked up as much like any other weather event would be on weather radar data here in Southern Ontario. And this work has gained a lot of traction actually since I've worked at Nature Canada. They've done a lot of great work since I've been part of the organization. You can see this was a CBC article published from earlier this year talking about the roost at Long Point. I'm sure many of you in the audience have been to Long Point in Ontario before. And this is an article from the New York Times about, again, a purple martin roost and the importance of weather radar and looking at purple martins in the United States. So I spent my entire summer that year at Nature Canada trying to track down these roosts. So we tagged them. Richard was talking a little bit earlier about the MODA system. We tagged them with these radio transmitters to see how the birds interact with the roosts. And also we were really interested in what sort of human-associated infrastructure caused these roosts to change. And this is really important because a lot of swallow species in Canada are species at risk, or they're species of conservation concern, barn swallow, bank swallow, and the like. And swallows and aerial insectivores are rapidly declining. And these roosts, which make up a really, really important part of their annual life cycle, are largely unknown. No one really doesn't know anything about these things, even though they occur, in areas where there's huge industrialization. They're in largely agricultural areas where there's lots of pesticide spraying and so on. So obviously we needed to do something to really inform folks and to mitigate the effects of humans on these particularly sensitive areas. So when I came back from my job at Nature Canada, I went back to university where I was studying neuroscience. And luckily, I ended up in a research group that allowed me to combine my newfound interest for birds and my university degree looking at brains. And a few years later, I got to revisit this idea of how humans impact bird behavior from a different perspective, while also incorporating some of the more recent work that I've done as part of my undergraduate and my graduate work on birds and their brains. So this project was very much a COVID-inspired side project for me. Some folks, they learned how to juggle, or they learned a new language, or learned how to knit. And I spent my time in COVID isolation writing, and this was the product. So a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about today is from this edited book chapter from a book called Songbird Behavior and Conservation in the Anthropocene. And if at the end of this talk, any of you want a copy of this chapter, just let me know, and I'm happy to send along an e-copy to you folks. I don't actually know whether this book is still being published. I don't hear anything about those things. But anyways, I'm happy to send along a copy for free if you want to learn more about it. And I won't go any further without acknowledging the fact that this work wouldn't have been possible were it not for my excellent collaborators and co-authors, all of whom I consider colleagues and mentors, including my primary research supervisor and advisor, Dr. Leslie Fillmore in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, as well as Dr. Andrew Horn in the Department of Biology, former president of the Nova Scotia Bird Society. I'm sure lots of you know Andy, as well as Dr. Scott McDougall-Shackleton from the Advanced Facility for Avian Research at the University of Western Ontario. So to start off, though, I want to be more clear here. When I'm talking about birds in this presentation, most of the time I'm going to be talking about songbirds. So songbirds, also known as passerines, make up the largest order of bird, comprising just about 60% of all birds on the planet. And what distinguishes songbirds from other birds, like waterfowl or raptors or shorebirds, for example, is that much like us humans, songbirds learn their vocalizations, so their songs or their calls, from an adult tutor, usually their parents, very early on in their life. Songbirds also have really specialized anatomy to help them produce their elaborate songs, like the syrinx, which is the songbird's vocal organ. And they also have dedicated brain regions, which we'll talk about in a second, that allow them to listen to, learn, and to respond to produce their songs. And what I find fascinating about these things, about songbirds, is that what makes songbirds songbirds is what makes songbirds really interesting to study in the context of neuroscience or brain research. So as I said before, songbirds are one of a few species on this planet, which also happens to include humans, who learn their vocalizations by learning and imitating an adult tutor. And this process, which is known collectively as vocal learning, starts very early on in a songbird's life. And there's actually some really interesting recent research to show that it might start before the birds hatch. It happens while the birds are in the egg. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to talk about what happens after the birds hatch. And we know a lot about songbirds and vocal learning from work in zebra finches. And zebra finches are a species native to Australia, but they're also a very well-known laboratory model species, and also birds that some of you might have as pets at home. Lots of folks have zebra finches as pets. But the same processes that we're going to talk about in zebra finches also happen in other songbirds, although the timelines might be slightly different. But anyways, we're talking about vocal learning. And in the first phase of vocal learning, which is called here the sensory phase, a young bird listens to and memorizes the song or the vocalization of its adult tutor, its parent. In the second phase, which is called the sensory motor phase, the young bird starts to practice its vocalizations, right? It memorizes its song, and then it starts to do it itself, right? And it relies on auditory feedback. That is, it listens to itself while it's doing its practicing to make corrections and modifications to make sure that its song matches the model that it learned from its parent. And this sensory motor phase ends with what's known as song crystallization, where the song becomes essentially much more set in stone and less sensitive to change. And what's really interesting about this timeline for vocal learning is that it very much mirrors what we see in humans, with there being a critical period very early in life where most vocal learning occurs, especially in the context of the brain, and disruptions to what happens during this critical period can result in atypical or aberrant vocalizations. So In addition to the developmental timeline that we just talked about, there are also lots of similarities between the songbird brain and the human brain. And obviously, this is a very technical diagram. I'm not going to talk about everything that you see here, but what I hope you take away from this image is that the regions and the pathways and the connections in the brain that allow songbirds to listen to, learn, and produce their bird song are very similar in both structure and connectivity to the pathways and connections in our human brain that allow us to perceive, interpret, and respond to changes in our environment. So zooming in on the songbird brain just a little bit more here, and this is a figure from the chapter. Again, very complicated. I'm not, there's not going to be a test at the end of the talk. But in the songbird brain, there are specific structures and pathways that allow them to listen to, learn, and produce song. And this is known as the vocal control system. And there are three brain regions that I want you to focus on in particular. If you take anything away from this figure, it's these three. And these are HVC, which funnily enough doesn't stand for anything. It's not an acronym. It's just three letters stuck together, RA and Area X. And these are the three brain regions that are largely responsible for helping birds produce their song. And what's remarkable about these three brain regions is that they are critical for learning and producing birdsong, but they're also incredibly plastic. So they're very sensitive to change. So changes in vocal behavior in birds leads to changes in these three brain regions. So for example, let's take a step back for a second. I'm sure all of you recognize these photos of indigo buntings. Indigo buntings are actually showing up kind of en masse in Nova Scotia this year. I don't know why. It seems like there are much more around this year than there have been in previous years. But anyways, what distinguishes these photos, they're the same species. They're both males, but what distinguishes these photos is the time of the year that these photos were taken. The photo on the left shows a breeding male, presumably in spring, and the photo on the right shows a non-breeding male, presumably taken in fall. And just by looking at their appearances here, you can see that there are obvious differences, right? They're both male, they're both indigo buntings, but breeding males have much brighter plumage, whereas non-breeding males are certainly not as bright, they're fairly drab. Behaviorally, they're also quite different as well. Breeding males, they're constantly singing. Hopefully you can hear that, that's the song. Constantly singing, whereas non-breeding males are essentially quiet. There's very little song production in non-breeding indigo buntings in the non-breeding season. So what you have here is you've got these seasonal changes in behavior and physiology, so changes in appearance and in their bodies, but also changes in behavior. And going back to this idea that I talked about right at the beginning about the brain behavior interaction, you might wonder, okay, well, how do these changes in singing behavior affect changes in the brain regions that help them sing? So perhaps not surprisingly, we have these seasonal changes in singing behavior. We also see seasonal changes in the brain structures supporting singing behavior. So remember these three that I talked about before, HVC, RA, and X. These are responsible for singing. They're the brain regions responsible for helping birds produce their song. And this is a study, this is a zoomed in photo of the songbird brain, this time in eastern towhees, who again are showing up in Nova Scotia right around this time. And similar to indigo buntings, differences in physiology and behavior between breeding males and non-breeding males, right? So the breeding males, they're singing constantly, right? Hopefully you heard that. They're singing constantly, whereas non-breeding males, they're not singing much at all. So because you have this increased song production in the spring in breeding males, the brain regions that support singing are much larger, right? Whereas in non-breeding males in the wintertime, the brain regions are quite small. So this panel on the left shows the brain in breeding condition and breeding season, right? They're singing a lot. There's actually way more neurons or brain cells in these regions during the spring. And then in the winter, when the birds aren't singing, there are fewer cells, the regions are much smaller. And then the following spring, the same thing happens again. These regions grow in size, more neurons are added, and then in the winter, they shrink again. And so seasonal changes in behavior and singing behavior are also associated with seasonal changes in the brain. And change in the brain is also called a fancy word known as neuroplasticity, which I'm sure some of you have heard before, neuroplasticity. Okay, so now that we've talked a bit about birds and vocal behavior and their brains, let's talk a bit about humans. So the Anthropocene is the proposed geological era, which starts at approximately the time where humans began to have a major impact on the Earth and its ecosystems, including human-associated or anthropogenic climate change. And the official start point of the Anthropocene is not really agreed upon. Different historians and geologists and anthropologists all have different definitions, but generally, let's say for at least for the purposes of this presentation, that the Anthropocene began in the mid-20th century. And since the approximate beginning of this anthropogenic era, or the Anthropocene, North America's birds have seen drastic declines. This study by Rosenberg et al. A few years ago showed that in North America alone, bird populations have declined by almost 30%, or 3 billion individuals since 1970. And most of these are songbirds, right? Sparrows, wood warblers, icterids, finches. The red here are where you see the declines. And there are numerous reasons for why we're seeing these huge declines in bird population, and most of which are actually human-associated or anthropogenic in nature. So the focus of this work that I've been doing as part of this project, and what we'll be talking about for the remainder of this presentation, are 3 human-associated or anthropogenic factors: anthropogenic noise, changing habitats and its impact on food availability, and also environmental contaminants. And specifically, we're going to talk about how each of these factors affects not only vocal learning in songbirds, but also the neural infrastructure, if you'd like, supporting vocal learning in songbirds. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on noise and contaminants, mostly because these are the 2 that folks are much more interested in, and they're very much hot topics these days. But it's actually also where most of the research interest, at least from a scientific perspective, has been over the last few years. So to start off, anthropogenic noise, that is human-associated noise, and this is probably the anthropogenic factor or the human-associated factor that has been studied the most in the context of bird behavior. And what we do know is that birds that are in noisier, most often urban areas, so they're exposed to more human-associated or anthropogenic noise, they sing more often, they change the bioacoustics of their song, they sing at higher frequencies, so the actual bioacoustics of their song, the frequency is higher. Their songs are often much lower quality than birds that are in less noisy, mostly rural areas. Birds also shift their dawn chorus to avoid anthropogenic noise as much as possible. So if you think about it, if a bird is near, for example, a very busy highway, it will shift its dawn chorus to avoid anthropogenic noise associated with that highway. So for example, early in the morning, you're going to have a lot of traffic. The dawn chorus will shift to make sure that the chorus isn't impacted as much by the anthropogenic noise. And lastly, birds in noisy or urban areas have reduced breeding success. And when we go back to the developmental timeline that I was just talking about earlier, anthropogenic or human-associated noise can really affect 2 aspects of vocal learning. It can either mask tutor song during the sensory phase, that is, make it really difficult for the young bird to actually hear its tutor's song, but it can also affect the song template that a young bird uses during the sensory motor phase to practice its song. And any impacts that noise might have during this developmental timeline can really have long-term effects, because song crystallization occurs very rapidly after the vocal learning period. And in many songbird species, after crystallization, there's very little change. So whatever they practice during this vocal learning period is what they have for the rest of their lives. And this idea of noise impacting developmental vocal learning, is illustrated really nicely by this study that was done in 2008 by Marty Leonard and Andy Horn from Dalhousie, who showed that anthropogenic noise can actually affect the structure and the bioacoustics in juvenile tree swallow vocalizations. So again, lots going on in this plot, don't have to worry about it. But what it essentially shows is that young tree swallows who were exposed to anthropogenic noise early in their life, so 5 days, 10 days, 15 days after hatching, who in this plot are the black bars, have a higher minimum frequency. So their minimum frequency is increased, and the range of frequency for songs is narrower overall. So the bioacoustics of their vocalization change with noise. And what this plot doesn't show, but what they showed in their study, is that the differences that they found early on persisted even in the absence of noise. So when they were moved to an environment where there wasn't any noise, these differences still persisted. And this suggests that noise actually may permanently affect the development of these vocalizations, not only when the swallows are quite young, but also through into adulthood. So we know that noise impacts singing behavior and vocal behavior. What about the brain? This study from Potvin et al. From the University of Western Ontario showed that zebra finches who were exposed to anthropogenic noise early in life showed differences in the sizes of the brain regions associated with vocal learning. So in this study, remember, HVC, area X, those were two that I was focusing on earlier. And what they showed was that birds who were exposed to moderate and high amounts of anthropogenic noise had smaller area X compared to those not exposed to noise, and birds exposed to moderate noise had smaller HVC. So these brain regions were much smaller, they shrunk, and by extension were functionally different in birds that were raised in noise than birds who were raised without noise. So not only does noise affect behavior, but it can also affect the brain. And one thing I want to talk about just quickly about anthropogenic noise is that while I was spending my COVID isolation time writing my chapter, researchers in the States were spending their isolation time looking at how birds responded to the rapid shift in human activities as a result of the pandemic. So what happens when anthropogenic noise suddenly stops? And this study gained a lot of traction. It was published in early 2021. So some of you may have heard it or have heard media reports about it. But what they showed was that in response to the pandemic, where everyone was essentially forced back into their homes, they weren't commuting, noise levels in the study area dropped, right? What this panel shows is that these are urban areas, the red dots. The background noise level decreased. And what they showed was that in response to this, in white-crowned sparrows, particularly those in urban areas, adjusted their bioacoustics of their vocalizations very rapidly. So remember earlier we said noise usually makes song frequency increase. We saw that during the pandemic in white-crowned sparrow, song frequency actually decreased in response to anthropogenic noise, presumably back to levels pre-Anthropocene. And similarly, vocal performance in white-crowned sparrows dramatically increased. So their songs were better quality when essentially there was less anthropogenic noise as a result of the pandemic. And what this shows, at least to me, is that not only that birds are, again, very plastic when it comes to their behavior, but also that they're very resilient, right? That is, they can respond to what was essentially a very rapid change in the soundscape that had persisted essentially for the last 50 years, right? So we've been having anthropogenic noise for the last 50 years-ish, 70 years-ish. And very rapidly, when everything shut down, everyone back into their homes, noise decreased. Songbird song adapted very readily. And that to me shows a degree of resilience in these species that I think is quite unique. So again, main takeaways on noise here. What I just wanted to say very quickly is that obviously noise interferes with the vocal signals. Noise could mask tutor song and compromises the juvenile song template. Noise during development affects the brain. But in the absence of anthropogenic noise, like during the pandemic, songbirds can very quickly bounce back if you'd like. So like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on human-associated changes in habitat. We can talk about that during the Q&A, but just for the purposes of time, I want to talk a little bit about environmental contaminants. And I know this is a big topic. I could talk about it for a whole presentation. I could teach an entire class on it. There's lots of really crazy things associated with contaminants. But in this project, we looked at 3 particular environmental contaminants and the effects that they have on birds, their behavior, and their brains. And these are heavy metals, organo halides, and pesticides. So we're going to talk about these fairly quickly. So first, heavy metals are released into the environment from a bunch of different sources, including anthropogenic sources like fossil fuel burning and mining operations. And one heavy metal in particular is mercury. And mercury can accumulate in the water and in the atmosphere and very quickly find its way into the food chain and into birds. And there's tons of work showing that there are behavioral differences between sites polluted with mercury and sites that aren't polluted with mercury. That is, birds at a polluted site sing differently than birds that aren't at a polluted site. And this study by Yu et al. In 2017 showed that birds that were exposed to mercury had significantly larger brains than birds that weren't exposed to mercury pollution. And so you might think, okay, wow, if they've got bigger brains, that's great for the birds, they're very smart, excellent. But in fact, the overall changes in the size of the brains here are likely to due to some sort of inflammatory response in response to the heavy metal pollution, and that causes a whole suite of negative effects, not only on behavior, but also on other things like survival. And so it's not a great thing. Another well-studied environmental contaminant are organo halides, which are a special class of chemical found commonly in what are known as flame retardants. So these things essentially keep your house from burning down very quickly. They're found in a variety of household and industrial products, like you see here in this image, in furniture, in plastics, like the plastic surrounding your TV. And one particular flame retardant that folks have done a lot of work on are called polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs for short. And although that these flame retardants are widely regulated, especially in Canada, these chemicals continue to persist and accumulate in our environment, usually at landfills, usually at waste disposal sites, and pose a serious threat to species which congregate in these areas. So obviously, birds very much congregate near waste disposal sites. Think about seagulls, think about other species. So these flame retardants have effects on behavior and brain. And one study I want to quickly talk about is this one here by Eng et al., who again showed that birds who were exposed to high amounts of these flame retardants had significant reductions in the size of the important brain regions that are responsible for vocal production and learning. So obviously we have behavioral changes and brain changes as well as a result of this pesticide. And lastly, I just want to talk briefly about pesticides. Some of the more well-studied pesticides and their effects on birds are organophosphates, carbamates, and neonicotinoids. And these pesticides largely work by their effects on the nervous system. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that these pesticides have effects on the brain and behavior. So our nerves release a chemical called acetylcholine. This is a nerve. It releases a chemical called acetylcholine. This chemical is important for the proper functioning of our nerves and how our nerves connect to our muscles. And this chemical gets broken down by another chemical called acetylcholinesterase. And this is really important because without it, we would be constantly overstimulating our muscles and our important organs. Neonicotinoids work by preventing this acetylcholinesterase from working. So they work, essentially, by overstimulating one's nerves and one's muscles and one's internal organs to the point that it leads to paralysis and death. And usually, this is how it works in insects, but it also is how it works in sort of secondary species like birds as well. And the work on songbirds and the effects of pesticides are obviously preliminary because it's very difficult to study this, keeping in mind all important ethical regulations and things like that. But just by understanding that these pesticides work by affecting the nervous system, you can see that they undoubtedly have effects on brain and behavior. So that was all doom and gloom. What can we do to work on this? First of all, what we found in this project was that research in birds is actually lagging behind the work associated with human or anthropogenic impacts on other species, like marine species. So some of you may know there's actually a lot of legislation, a lot of really important work that's done to protect marine species and the possible impacts of humans and, for example, boats and things on marine species. Not a lot of work on birds. So obviously much more work is needed there. And both laboratory-based studies and field-based studies are needed to really get behind this. And lastly, obviously there are conservations that are needed in order to mitigate against this. And in the chapter that we talk about a few potential conservation efforts, but there are other chapters in the book that really dive into this more. There are tons of ways that we can deal with the effects of anthropogenic noise, for example, erecting noise barriers, using noise-friendly materials. But the main way that we deal with the issues of habitat loss and pesticide use is essentially more regulation, and in some cases, bans, right? Especially as it relates to pesticides, we have a model in terms of what to do to help these birds recover. We've done it before, And the pesticide, for example, DDT, which was widely used in the early 20th century until there was a push to ban it, largely because of the work that Rachel Carson did in her excellent book, Silent Spring, that I'm sure some of you know about. DDT had really terrible impacts on birds, particularly raptors and birds of prey like eagles and osprey. And DDT was banned in the United States and in other countries in the early 1970s. And what we can see is that this has had an effect, right? Very in contrast to a lot of other bird species, birds of prey are actually thriving. They're not declining. And this is in large part due to the importance of banning DDT in the early 1970s. So we know how to mitigate the issue of pesticides here. We just have to get rid of them. So wrapping up here, I know that I'm sort of getting close to time here, and I know that there are questions, and I'm happy to answer them. But what I want you to take away from this is that there are multiple pathways through which the Anthropocene can compromise songbirds' vocal learning and the underlying brain regions supporting vocal learning in birds. But what I want you to take away from this is that songbirds are actually remarkably resilient to a lot of anthropogenic change, right? We can see that songbird populations have rebounded in response to pesticide use and pesticide bans. We can see that songbird vocalization have rebounded in response to the pandemic, right? So there's a degree of resilience here that I think we can take advantage of when we're trying to come up with habitat conservation efforts to really help mitigate against human-associated impacts on birds. And ultimately, what I hope you take away from this project is that in order for us to help with songbirds and to aid with songbird species survival, we need to figure out which habitat conservation efforts work and which ones don't. And to do this, we need research like some of the work that you've seen today to show how different changes in the environment influence behavior and brain, especially when it comes to such an important behavior like singing and vocalizing. So I know that was a lot. Thanks very much. Like I said, thanks very much to my collaborators and colleagues. Thanks very much to my funding sources and to you folks at the Nova Scotia Bird Society for inviting me. If you have any questions for me, if you'd like to read more about this project, please send me an email or reach out. But I'm also very happy to answer some questions just about now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brodie. That was excellent. There are some questions, and I'm going to start because I'm allowed to speak first. I was just typing one up, but I was just wondered if you might comment on this. So when I first started birding, there was a male Wilson's warbler at Sandy Cove in HRM. It was not a bird that you typically would see in that area. It's not good habitat, doesn't seem like good habitat for Wilson's warbler. However, it was surrounded by yellow warblers. This Wilson's warbler was a male, as I said, and it came in and it sang constantly for a couple summers. So anybody who wanted to get a Wilson's warbler on their list could come to Sandy Cove and find that one Wilson's warbler singing its poor little heart out.
I think I was probably one of those birders.
Aha. So one day I decided I thought that it sounded like a yellow warbler, and so I taped it. And during Christmas bird count, Fulton Lavender was at the house, and I played it without telling him Fulton anything. I just said, "Fulton, can you identify this bird?" And without hesitating, he said, "It sounds like a Wilson's imitating a yellow."
Yeah.
I just wondered what you thought about that. Do you think it was, during its critical period, learned from a yellow?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's tons of different ways that you can obviously and I think there are a couple of questions in here about this as well. But the way I talked about the vocal learning period is what usually happens 99% of the time, and just by the nature of different songbirds, particularly wood warblers, the way that their habitats are and the way that their territories sometimes overlap, obviously young songbirds are not just hearing one sound during their developmental period, right? They're not just hearing their tutor. They're learning from it, hopefully, and they can identify that, okay, this, I don't really want to anthropomorphize the birds, but they're going, this is my adult tutor, so I should probably pay attention to that. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes, for some reason that we don't fully know about, they can tack on to some other sound source, and that gets integrated into their vocalizations. what's also really interesting is that there are some species whose song change over the course of their lifetime. So many songbird species are what's known as closed-ended learners. So they learn their song very early in development and that's it. But there are some species, like for example, European starlings, who add to their repertoire all throughout their life, right? So you can hear sometimes a starling who's imitating a blue jay, probably because it heard a blue jay and was like, I think that's real. Again, don't mean to anthropomorphize the birds, but they're like, that's really interesting. I'm going to add it to my repertoire. And they suddenly start to imitate. So obviously, there's a lot more nuance to the period of vocal learning. But in the majority of some species, right, the majority of species, excuse me, they're closed-ended learners. They learn their period early in development, 90 days or so after hatch. Sometimes that's a little bit longer if they migrate. But anyways, and that's it, right? That's the song that they'll sing for the rest of their life. So there's really cool experimental work showing that if you take for example, a blue tit, the nestling from a blue tit, and you put it in the nest of a great tit, the blue tit will learn the songs of the great tits and not the songs of the blue tits. So there's obviously some learning going on, because if it was some sort of inherent process that these birds did without tutoring, you could put them wherever and they would sing constantly the same way. So I hope that answered your question. And I know that there are a couple of other ways. Yeah, absolutely. Imitating songs of other species. There are some species that can imitate, others can't. And it's also, indicator of fitness. Yeah, absolutely. I see that there was a point in there.
Another way to show off, really. That's
yeah,
great.
absolutely.
Yeah. Ken had a similar question there.
Same. That's what I was sort of trying to get at there as well. Wood warblers are particularly interesting when it comes to their developmental period. And there are some folks in this audience who I'm sure are much more knowledgeable about wood warblers than I am. Cowbirds, was a good question. Sorry, I'm just seeing the chat pop up and I'm
yeah, good for you.
Wood warblers are particularly interesting, and we actually don't know a whole lot about how they learn their songs. I know James Churchill, I don't know if he's in the audience, he did some work on American redstarts. They're very enigmatic when it comes to learning their songs.
Neat. There was a question from Jean earlier on there. Can you elaborate on lower quality song and what that means? Is it less complex?
Yeah, that's part of it. Absolutely. Different studies define high quality versus low quality in different ways. Usually it involves considering all the different bioacoustic features. It's very much complexity is definitely one of them. Frequency and bandwidth and all of these things are also part of it. But most of the time it's some definition that the study comes up with to say this is what a complex song is and which one isn't. And there are some pretty common definitions of that are used. Like I said, vocal learning is not my primary area of interest or my primary area of research interest. I do a lot of work with food storing birds and black-capped chickadees and things like that. You all were fortunate to hear Ben Sonnenberg speak a couple of months ago about his really exciting work on food storing birds. We do similar work in our lab, and that's sort of what my work has been primarily over the last few years, but I'm sort of transitioning more into vocal learning and brain behavior stuff in the context of vocal work. So lots more work that needs to be done in the future.
That's pretty cool. I had another question back here. If there's birds that miss their critical period, or if their critical period overlaps with the period of time when COVID caused that quiet, how would you expect that to change the trajectory of their life? So now they're obviously the noise is starting up.
That's a really interesting question, Diane. I'm sure there's a lot of really exciting work that's being done on that right at this exact second. But I would suspect that, we see that experimental introduction of noise causes birds, even past their critical period, to adjust their songs to sort of accommodate for the noise. Like I said before, their song necessarily doesn't change, right? The structure and the main chunks of it, but the frequency might change so they can sort of avoid the noise, if you'd like. If this is the noise, they'll sort of adjust their song up here. I would suspect that birds that sort of sang in the normal pre-Anthropocene range are probably adjusting, but I don't fully know. I know Elizabeth Derryberry, who did that study that was out in Science. She's got a whole whack of research on those birds. And I am certain that that's going to be work that comes out very soon.
Well, hopefully you'll be able to come back and talk about
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Susan Holmes has a really great question here. You can read it yourself if you like, but it's
Yeah,
basically
absolutely.
about mob calls and playback, and it
Yeah,
certainly is something that I have a love and hate of the mob call
me
because
too.
yeah, I do use it occasionally. I try really hard not to use it. I bird my birding partner on my daily birding partner does not like it at all. So when I go birding with my husband Sean, we just don't use it at all. But occasionally I do use it. But I do find it. I have mixed feelings about it myself, and I have mixed feelings about it when other people use it too.
Mhm. Yeah, so the question, yeah, about mob calls. What I would say first is I'll preface it by saying I am by no means, the be all end all authority on whether mob calls should be used and whether they shouldn't be used. It's a very hot topic. It's a hot topic among birders. It's a hot topic among scientists. I was at a conference over the summer where this came up, and you would think that there would be like fisticuffs in the audience among like scientists about the use of mobbing calls or not. But what I will say is that there is tons of research out there showing that using playback, whether it be for research purposes or whether it be for more casual birding purposes, definitely affects the behavior part of it. So in response to playback, birds will behave differently in their environment. And everyone sort of knows that, right? Because that's sort of why we use it, right? Playback is used so that birds that are in the brush pop out, right? They're instinctively changing their behavior so that we can see them. But one thing I didn't want to talk, that I didn't really talk much about in my presentation today, mostly for time, is that a big part of my book chapter is the effect that noise might have on birds via stress, right? And how the effect of noise and its effects on stress might influence brain and behavior sort of indirectly. But unfortunately, the research on that is quite mixed. And to my knowledge, there isn't really a direct yes or no answer to whether there's a connection between playback and stress. But what there is evidence from some studies is that they've shown that the stress hormone in birds, which is called corticosterone, the bird equivalent of cortisol, which is our stress hormone in humans, that corticosterone will shoot up in response to playback, and elevated levels of corticosterone sort of consistently can have detrimental impacts on the brain and behavior. But that's especially so, for example, during the breeding season, when birds are naturally stressed anyway. They have high levels of stress hormone anyway, because they're very much focused on reproducing, and their energy levels, their energy expenditure is through the roof. They're very stressed. They're competing against other males. They're trying to secure a female. They're devoting a lot of their energy to their offspring, and that is inherently stressful for the birds. So when you play playback, you're adding on top of that, and that might have some sort of impact. But unfortunately, the research is a bit mixed. It might depend on the species. It might affect, or excuse me, it might be a result of how long you do the playback for, whether you do it for like a second versus whether you stick a speaker out in the woods and play it for 40 minutes. But what I will say, I guess, is that playback is a really important tool in bird research. And when it's used appropriately in a well-designed, well-managed kind of way, can be very valuable to get data that you wouldn't necessarily get otherwise. But it can also be quite detrimental if you don't use it properly, and especially at times of the year when birds are necessarily or are inherently more vulnerable to stress, right? If you'd like. So in breeding season in particular, my personal choice, and again, that's all it is, personal choice, is you'd probably avoid a playback during breeding season. But there are some really good, accessible, science-based guidelines that are out there to help birders with the use of playback in the field. I know that there's one by one of my colleagues, Lauren Benedict at the University of somewhere, Colorado, maybe, that she did a really nice accessible guide that I'm happy to share with folks if I can find it, if you'd be interested. Very science-based. I know lots of folks have questions about this, but like I said, it's a very hot topic. I'm not going to be the moral authority on this. But yeah, I'm happy to share that at some point. I'll try and find it and put it in the chat maybe. Hopefully that answers your question, Susan.
And we can share that on Facebook as well. And
Certainly.
it is a hot topic. Actually, it's a topic that we've thought about having a discussion on, but we thought it might be too hot. So I'm glad to have the question here. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't I don't disagree. I think I have mixed feelings about it. I've used it before in my research, but I have mixed feelings about using it for research. I have mixed feelings about using it in the field. It doesn't go away. There isn't an answer that anyone is happy with, right? You know, these researchers who study birds their entire lives and they're, you know, in their 90s will get very hot and, you know, will be willing to really fight folks about it. And I had firsthand evidence of this at a conference earlier this year.
Yeah, I guess the other consideration is that that birders need to consider other birders as well. That
Certainly.
and then there's some areas where it's played very frequently, and some places where it's very infrequent, and that would have a different impact on birds.
And birds adapt to the playback, and sometimes that can be to their detriment.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. If you're constantly playing some sort of alarm call that birds realize eventually over time, they learn there's not really an alarm here, and suddenly a real alarm happens.
They don't distinguish.
Yeah. There are impacts there as well.
So mixed feelings are appropriate. Angela's question about cowbirds. Did you want to? That's the last question that I see here. Anyone else?
We'll probably have to talk about this a little bit more. Cowbirds are incredibly unique. And the way that they vocalize and how they learn their vocalizations are different than many other birds, as you said, because they're what are known as brood parasites. So they lay their eggs in the nests of other species and they're raised by other species. There's actually some evidence to suggest that there might be some degree of vocal learning actually happening in the egg, or like there's something is sort of inherent in the cowbirds and not in other species. But they also incorporate elements from other species into some of their vocalizations as well. So there's this idea of, like, if you've ever heard of this before, nature nurture, right? The effects of your, you know, inherent genetic background, if you'd like, the cowbirdness, if you'd like, and the host both play a role in the vocalizations of this species. I don't know enough about cowbirds in terms of vocalizations. They're also very interesting when it comes to spatial behavior and things like that, because female cowbirds remember the locations of their nests even after they've deposited their eggs, and they go back and check them sometimes. And to do that, they have really specialized brains that allow them to do that. That's another presentation. But yeah, I think cowbirds are really unique. I don't know enough about them to really give you a definitive answer on that. But yeah, there's this idea that there might be something unique about cowbirds in their sort of genetic background that helps them vocalize, but there's also something, you know, they're also not immune to the critical period, if you'd like.
Okay, interesting. I'm sure we could do a whole.
We'll talk more. Don't stress.
That's great.
We got lots of opportunities to talk about cowbirds.
Well, folks, it's 8:00. We're right on time here. I don't see any more questions, but if you want to take a moment now and take your mute off and show yourselves, that'd be great. And if there's any last questions for Brodie, please either enter them in the chat immediately or just take yourself off mute and let us know what this question is.
Sure. And I can I just put my email back up on the screen here, Diane. Brodie, B as in boy, P as in park, @dal.ca. If you have any questions that you want to send me out by email. I know that there are some folks here who want to see the chapter, so I'm happy to send that along as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, awesome. Some really nice thanks and good, really wonderful feedback that you can hold on to, copy and paste into your feedback file, so that when you're having a bad day, you'll have this to look back on. It was an excellent presentation, Brodie. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So who's going to go birding tomorrow and listen for bird calls?
Next year. And there.
It looks like it might be a good couple days on Saturday. Maybe even tomorrow afternoon might be good for Sea Watch. There we go, Susan. All right. Well, thanks everyone. It was good to see everybody tonight. And our next meeting again is just the last Thursday of this month, so just a couple weeks away, and we'll be talking barn swallows. Susan, thank you so much for setting these up. I really appreciate your help. Makes it so easy.
Brodie and everyone, in the Facebook event is the link to your chapter in the book.
Yeah, except they probably won't be able to get access to it. So you might have to email me for a copy of it.
Oh, I could.
Maybe, yeah. Sometimes
Maybe it's changed now, but
Might.
I looked at it before, so.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. It's one of those papers that, I mean, I usually get access to papers through DAO. It's actually one of the very few that you can't get access to through DAO because of the publisher and because it's an edited book and things like that. So if there are questions, like, I mean, it might be out there, but last time I checked it, it wasn't really super accessible unless you buy the book, and I wouldn't recommend you buy the book. You can just ask me for my paper.
For those of you still on, I'm just going to share my screen. I took some pictures today of a bird. I don't. It's not identifiable, but I thought it's funny to look at it. These are the pictures from Chubbucto Head. Any guesses as to species or family or?
Is that from Fiona?
No,
I
that's
think-
from today.
I know, but I forget the species that was.
The
It
petrel.
looks like it. My brain is not functioning, but it looks similar, even though it's grainy.
Yeah, very green.
Um,
It was very far out. I suspect it's a Jaeger.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Brodie, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot. Oh, am I on mute? Yeah. I don't know a whole lot about Jaegers, but it looks Jaegery to me in my very limited experience in on campus.
It looked like a Jaeger in the field. There was actually quite a few, so it might be a good. Last year, September timeframe, we had a good migration of Jaegers go by Chubbucto Head,
Yeah.
but we haven't had any much in the way of southeast winds, so we didn't see them this September. But maybe the next couple of days might be a little different. David, can you see those images? Those terrible grainy images? Which actually I'm kind of proud of because that I got the camera on the bird is really amazing.
You need to get out there with your scope.
Well, I did have my scope and I looked at it through the scope. Yeah.
Diane, it looks like the belly is quite light.
Yeah. Belly was white.
Wingtips are narrow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it a magnificent frigate bird? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. It is actually. For sure. 100%.
Is Eric Mills here?
No, he's not. I can send this file to Eric.
I think Eric's the.
Sarah might be able to help with this too, Dan.
Yeah.
Sarah Gutowski. I don't know if she's like here right now.
Okay.
She might be out in the field.
Yeah, it's I mean this is the reality of trying to see birds in the field when they're this far off. They're this is more than, I'd say, at least 1.5 kilometers offshore, because it was at least 1 kilometer from the shoreline to the buoys is I think about 1 kilometer. And these birds, few of them went by. So seriously, that I can find the bird in the viewfinder, the camera, is a huge accomplishment. And so I don't mind not actually being able to, but it does look like it has a black head there. It was really kind of intriguing, and it flew like a Jaeger. It did look like a Jaeger to me, kind of that heavy belly too. Anyway, I'll send them off for entertainment value.
Yeah, because
There it says.
limited experience, but my first reaction was more a shearwater, but I'm
Yeah, and it could be. It didn't fly like a shearwater.
okay, yeah. Which I can't get that from the still photos. So
No. I know the Jason thought that the underwing looked good for quarries, but it didn't glide at all. It didn't. It was flapping the whole time. It didn't fly.
okay, yeah, okay.
And it didn't have limited, stiff wing beats or limited range in the movement.
Okay, okay. That sounds good. I think you're right then.
Yeah. Anyway, so hopefully we'll have better looks at more Jaegers in the future, or whatever they are. Thanks, folks. Hope to see you soon in the field. Good night.
Thanks,
I know.
folks.